My original decision to devote myself to science was a direct result of the discovery which has never ceased to fill me with enthusiasm since my early youth, the comprehension of the far from obvious fact that the laws of human reasoning coincide with the laws governing the sequences of the impressions we receive from the world about us. That, therefore, pure reasoning can enable man to gain an insight into the mechanism of the latter. I love this quote from Max Planck's Autobiography, which is published posthumously in 1949. And this is really the essence of his life's pursuit. He believed that our minds, our comprehension, our reasoning power aren't separate from nature, but they're actually connected and designed to help us understand nature's laws, how the universe works. He says, for all these men, devotion to science was, consciously or unconsciously, a matter of faith, a matter of a serene faith in a rational world order. And for Planck, physics wasn't just a scientific discipline or a career path. It was his calling to understand the mind of the universe, how the universe works, the laws that govern it. And Planck is largely credited as being the father of quantum theory for his discovery in 1900. He discovers that energy is not emitted continuously, but in discrete units or discrete packets. And this unintentionally launches the quantum mechanics revolution of the 1920s, and he wins the Nobel Prize for this in 1918. And I finished reading Planck's scientific autobiography and also his biography titled Planck, Driven by Vision, Broken by War. And that biography really captures the arc of his life perfectly. Planck was relentlessly driven by this singular vision that the universe operated according to beautiful, simple, elegant laws, and that through our pure reasoning, we could discover them. And it was really this faith in rationality that was his compass for life. But throughout his 89 years, he lives through 2 world wars and experiences unimaginable tragedies. In World War I, he loses his eldest son. And then over the next 3 years, he would lose both of his daughters. And in World War II, he loses his home in Berlin, his library, his friends, his colleagues, and finally his favorite child, who's his youngest from his first marriage, Erwin, is executed for an association and a plot to kill Hitler. But he never really gives up on science and duty. His personal motto for life was Man muss ein Optimist sein, and that's in German. In English, it means one must be an optimist. And as we'll see, he lived by that even during the darkest times. Max Planck was born in 1858 in Kiel, Germany, and he joins a pretty large family, a pretty well-off family, as the 4th of 5 children. His father is Wilhelm Planck, who was a respected legal scholar and lectured at the University of Kiel. And Planck would later write about his childhood. I was brought up in the tradition of the old Kantian ethics. Duty was the guiding principle of my life. And that word duty is absolutely crucial to understanding Planck, and we'll see it come up and again and again. This wasn't some abstract concept for him. This was really the bedrock of his entire approach to life and entire approach to science. He felt duty to his family, he felt duty to Germany, he felt duty to science, to trying to understand how the universe works and the laws that governed it. And he was really driven by this sense of duty to the truth and to knowledge. And we'll see this continuously comes up throughout his entire life, both from a personal perspective, but also from a scientific perspective. And the book says, what Planck did possess as a scientist was an uncommon brand of focus, an unmatched mental rigor. He continually honed his concentration's sharp edge in the furnace of faith. He knew in his bones that nature operated by some logical system, and he devoted himself to uncovering that system, no matter the obstacles or consequences. And Planck came from a pretty privileged background. His childhood included a household of servants and nannies and tutors, which allowed him to excel well in school, particularly in the languages and mathematics and religious studies. But interestingly, he was never really at the top of his class. And music, too, was actually a pretty big part of Planck's life. He had a beautiful singing voice. It was incredibly skilled at the piano. And he was actually so talented in music that he could have pursued a professional career, but obviously he ends up choosing science instead. And Planck said, I would have become a musician, but for the lack of real creative talent. And right, if you remember in episode 1, Einstein says almost the exact same thing. Einstein says, if I were not a physicist, I would probably be a musician. And what I think resonates with both Planck and Einstein is that both music and physics and mathematics They require deep appreciation for patterns, for harmony, and for beauty. And this is why I think music is constantly going to come up in some of these scientific biographies. And it's also important to understand the context in which Max is growing up in, because I think it influences partially his worldview, but also dictates some of the decisions he'll make later in life. So his childhood is coinciding with a pretty pivotal period in German history. So in the summer of 1870, Planck is about 12 years old here. France declares war on Germany, and though this war ends in German victory within just 6 months, it came at a very personal cost to both the Planck family and also many other German families. Max's older brother, Hermann, dies in battle, and because of this, the Planck family, and with all the other German families at the time, they become intensely patriotic. It says, the Planck family would see its own blood in the stitches of this new empire. And like so many others, they were intensely patriotic for life. And this early experience of loss and national pride really shaped Planck for life. His family became intensely patriotic, and this would be a sentiment that would later create complications during the Nazi era, as we'll talk about later in the episode. It was during his high school years that Max really first fell in love with physics, and he was inspired by his mathematics teacher. Planck talks about how his professor explained conservation of energy through a story of a bricklayer roofing a house that really grounded it for him. And the professor explained that every bit of energy that this bricklayer expends remains in those bricks for years, even centuries, and it eventually would be released when that brick falls back to Earth. And his professor really succeeded at bringing this idea of the conservation of energy to life. And Planck says, it was an absolute law of nature, independent of the bricklayer's identity or the building's structural choices. Only the weight and height of the stone mattered. And this idea was incredibly influential on Planck, that there are absolute laws in nature that operate independently of human desires or designs. And while many of his contemporaries rolled their eyes at this idea of universal principles, for Planck, this belief in the absolute was the fundamental fuel that kept science and himself running. He saw physicists as almost mythic figures who must, quote, search above all for the enduring, the indestructible, for what is independent of human senses. And Planck described this concept of the conservation of energy as being, quote, absorbed avidly like a revelation. And it's this single story from his teacher that really shaped much of his scientific career. And after finishing his secondary education, his high school, Planck begins university studies in Munich. And this is a really great story. So he gets to Munich and he tells his professor there that he wants to pursue physics. And his professor probably gives him one of the worst pieces of career advice in scientific history. So his professor tells Planck that physics was essentially a completed field. He said that physics was nearing its natural conclusion given the success of Newton's mechanics, Maxwell's electromagnetism, and the new and nearly complete field of thermodynamics. There was simply nothing left to discover. He thought of it as a dead end. His professor considered physics as a settled science. But Planck's response really tells you everything you need to know about his character and his scientific outlook. He wasn't dissuaded by his professor's response at all. He tells his professor he didn't mind if his life's work would be largely an end in itself for further and deeper edification. He would happily tend the garden of physics. And I absolutely loved this quote, because if you think about what Planck is saying here, he's not driven by fame or money or utility or the promise of launching a revolution. He sees science as a moral, logical, and aesthetic pursuit, a garden worth tending even if it seems fully grown. That the discipline of thinking clearly, using our pure reasoning about nature, was worth doing for its own sake, regardless of the outcome. And this tells you everything you need to know about Planck. This is his life's work. This is his compass for life. This is his guiding principle, right? And this aligns with exactly what we discussed at the opening of the episode. Planck devoted himself to science for no other reason other than understanding the mechanics of the universe. And it's actually ironic because although Planck just wanted to, quote, tend the garden, and he didn't care about launching a revolution, he unintentionally does trigger the quantum mechanics revolution of the 1920s that really completely transforms our understanding of reality. However, the earlier years of Planck's career were not marked by much success. He says, from the establishment, I found no interest, let alone approval for most of my earliest work. He wasn't some prodigy like Newton or Einstein or Dirac who had scientific breakthroughs in their 20s. he spent many of those years living with his parents, struggling to find a paid, secure position. After completing his doctoral thesis with highest honors, he doesn't even celebrate. He says, "None of my professors at the university had any understanding for my thesis, as I learned for a fact in my conversations with them." And this also happens later in Planck's life when he's delivering his theory in 1900 on radiation. The audience doesn't understand what he's talking about, nor do they understand the full implications. And at the same time, Planck also doesn't understand the full implications of what he's talking about. But his fortunes begin to change in April of 1885. He's 27 at the time. He accepts an appointment as associate professor of mathematical physics at the University of Kiel, where previously his father had taught. And in his autobiography, Planck writes, "This offer came as a message of deliverance. The moment he informed me of the particulars and conditions of my appointment was and will always be one of the happiest of my life. For even though my life in my parents' house was as beautiful and contented as any man could wish for, I was yearning for a home of my own." And it's interesting to know that as a lecturer, he was predictably quite dry, but incredibly logical and thorough. One of his students said, "The fascination and thrill I felt in Planck's lectures was inspired exclusively by the unfailing logic with which he developed his thoughts, allowing us to follow every step and to share with him the joy of some surprising discovery. Only on rare occasions was this grave, methodical stream of thought interrupted by some charming personal interlude." And that same student said that Planck implored his students to ask questions, since all outcomes of a question were good. And we talked about this in episode 3 with Richard Feynman, who also encouraged his students to ask questions. He said, "The students' questions remind me of problems I've given up on. They bring me back to ideas I might not see differently." So we're beginning to see common themes come up in each of these scientists' lives, right? First, it's maybe music with Einstein and Planck, and now it's this encouragement to students to ask good questions. I think we're continuously going to see more and more common themes across these scientists. And in 1889, Planck moved to the University of Berlin, which would become his academic home for the remainder of his career. And by 1894, Planck is 36. He devotes himself to thermodynamics, especially focusing on the second law and this concept of entropy, that the universe becomes more disordered over time. Planck turned his entire attention to this mysterious phenomenon known as black body radiation, which just describes the relationship between an object's temperature and the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation it emits. And he was drawn to this problem specifically because he sensed something universal within it. He writes, "Black body radiation represents something absolute. And since I had always regarded the search for the absolute as the loftiest goal of all scientific activity, I eagerly set to work." Again, we talked about this again and again. He's always seeking the absolute, the eternal, the objectivity of nature and the laws behind it. And what's interesting about black body radiation is that if you remove all the reflected light and measure only the energy that's emitting from an object's interior, that every object, regardless of its shape, its size, or material, emits exactly the same type of radiation at a given temperature. And the curves plotting this radiation at different temperatures are the same for all objects and substances. And the book says, "The curves whispered to him, hinting at something universal. A given curve is exactly the same for all objects and substances." And Planck would ask himself, why are their compositions, their sizes, and their physical shapes completely irrelevant? And he thought that the answer here would reveal something universal about nature. So he spends his entire focus, all of his time during the day, focused on solving this problem. But for 5 years, Planck struggled with this problem and couldn't find a sufficient solution. No matter how he approached it, his calculations didn't match what scientists observed in experiments. And he was frustrated. He tried years and years and years of trying to find a solution. And he decides to kind of flip his approach. So instead of starting with classical physics and working towards the answer, he decided to guess the right mathematical formula first, then figure out why it worked. And now Planck is faced with what he called the million Deutschmark question. Where did his equation come from? And he says, "My formula had merely the standing of a law disclosed by a lucky intuition. On the very day when I formulated this law, I began to devote myself to the task of investing it with a true physical meaning." And he continues, "After a few weeks of the most strenuous work of my life, the darkness lifted and an unexpected vista began to appear. To derive his equation mathematically, Planck had to make a critical assumption that went against all of conventional physics at the time. He had to treat energy as coming in discrete chunks and discrete packets rather than a continuous flow. He says, "We consider, however, that this is the most essential point of the whole calculation, E, energy, to be composed of a well-defined number of equal parts. This is absolutely revolutionary. Scientists at the time generally considered energy to be a continuous wave-like phenomenon, but Planck is suggesting that energy itself has some sort of granularity to it, that energy isn't continuous, but comes in these discrete packets, in these discrete units." And Einstein admired Planck's work as a, quote, "previously unimagined thought, the atomistic structure of energy." And in December 1900, Planck presents his new proof and his new theory. Historians and physicists really consider this the birth of quantum theory. However, at the time, his audience was reportedly pretty unimpressed. They didn't really understand, and they struggled to follow what Planck was talking about with his new mathematics. And years later, Planck would actually say, "It was a purely formal assumption, and I really did not give it much thought, except that no matter what the cost, I must bring about a positive result." So Planck wasn't trying to launch a revolution or quantum mechanics. He was really just trying to solve a specific problem, and he made what he thought was just a mathematical convenience. He never even used the word quantum in his 1900 presentation. Only later would he and most of the world really come to understand that this discovery had forever changed physics and launched the quantum mechanics revolution. And as one physicist who heard Planck speak in those early years said, he spoke of some of his attempts to avoid the quantum hypothesis if possible. His conclusions, however, were the following: "There is no way out. We shall see that it will penetrate into more and more fields of physics." And beyond his own abilities in science and physics, one of Planck's most remarkable attributes was his ability to recognize and champion revolutionary ideas, even when they challenged his own thinking. And this quality probably shines most clearly with his relationship with Albert Einstein. In 1905, Planck is serving as the editor for the journal Annalen der Physik, which is where most of the most important scientific papers were published at the time, specifically in Germany. And Planck received papers from a young Albert Einstein, who was relatively unknown at the time, right? He didn't have a PhD, he didn't have a university position, he was working as a patent clerk, and where others might have dismissed these papers, Planck recognizes Einstein's brilliance pretty immediately, and he decides to publish his papers in 1905. And the book says, "Where most others had doubts, Planck saw brilliance. He was certainly the first physicist to hold it aloft and spread the word, calling it relative theory." And for both Planck and Einstein, the beauty of nature was independent of whether or not us humans could discern or even stomach it. And that's pretty important, right? Because Planck struggled with this throughout his career. He's talking about mathematics and formulas and proofs that no one else can really understand, and that hinders the acceptance of some of his ideas. And now at the same time, this is happening to Einstein. Planck is being the champion he wished he had when he was delivering his ideas, his proofs, and his theories. Planck was uniquely embracing these revolutionary ideas and decides to continuously back and champion Einstein. The book says, "It is no exaggeration to say that Planck discovered Einstein, and he helped shepherd the squarest peg of Einstein's genius into the round hole of the science establishment. Max stood with young Einstein and said they had to stick together against waves of skeptics." And this was probably one of Planck's most incredible attributes, his ability to open and change his scientific mind, even at 47, which is, by time-honored stereotype, a somewhat stodgy age for physicists. He embraced the theory immediately and never looked back, even while the majority of physicists struggled to accept it. Einstein later says, "The main reason other physicists gave relativity a chance was the decisiveness and warmth with which Planck championed this theory." But interestingly, while Planck initially embraces Einstein's relativity idea, he rejects Einstein's quantum ideas, even though those ideas are building directly off of his own work from 1900. So in 1905, Einstein suggested that light itself came in packets or quote-unquote quanta. But in 1913, Planck was writing to the University of Berlin to accept Einstein's job offer, and he writes, that he, Einstein, might sometimes have overshot the target in his speculations, as for example in his light quantum hypothesis, should not be counted against him too much. And despite some of their scientific disagreements, Planck and Einstein developed a very deep friendship. After Einstein moves to Berlin in 1913, they play music together. Planck is on the piano, Einstein is on the violin, and Planck's youngest son, Erwin, is often joining them to form a trio. And their personalities were actually quite different. We can think of Planck as this incredibly serious, methodical, logical person, whereas Einstein, as we know, is generally unkept. He's humorous, he likes to make jokes, he's gregarious. But despite their difference in personalities, they shared this belief in a rational universe. The book says they both knew that the universe operated on a set of beautiful and simple principles. They believed in pursuing an ultimate truth, and they held their faith in this truth's existence as their indispensable guide, right? And this is the same thing in every episode we've done. Whether it's Planck, Feynman, Erdős, Einstein, they're all driven by this idea that the universe works by simple, elegant, beautiful laws, and their whole life's pursuit is trying to uncover them, trying to discover them. And in his later years, Planck finally admits that humans would never really be able to fully grasp the ultimate truth, but it's this act of forever chasing that is most worthy of human work. And in 1929, Planck says, perhaps we have every reason to consider the endlessness of this continuous struggle for the prize beckoning to us from an on high as a special blessing for the questioning spirit of man. It ensures that his two noblest impulses will endure and take fire again and again, enthusiasm and awe. I love this quote. Look how Planck is framing the scientific pursuit. It's not something we'll ever complete. It's an endless journey that keeps our, quote, noblest impulses alive. And Planck recognizes that science would never reach complete understanding, and he found a beauty in this perpetual quest. He says, for it is just a striving forward that brings us to the fruits which are always falling into our hands, and which are the unfailing sign that we are on the right road, and that we are ever and ever drawing nearer to our journey's end. But that journey's end will never be reached, because it is always the still far thing that glimmers in the distance and is unattainable. It is not the possession of truth, but the success which attends the seeking after it that enriches the seeker and brings happiness to him. And right, remember, he didn't mind if his life's work would be largely an end in itself. For further and deeper edification, he would happily tend the garden of physics. And Planck later says in an interview, the assumption that the universe has a composer and a beauty apart from our existence or understanding is never in doubt. And if we did not have faith but could solve every puzzle in life by an application of the human reason, what an unbearable burden life would be. This is an amazing statement. He's saying that if we could know everything, if there were no mysteries left, if there were no problems left, life would lose its meaning, right? It's this pursuit itself, the chase and quest after understanding that gives life its meaning. And in 1932, Einstein is writing a tribute for a book of a collection of Planck's essays, and his tribute gives you a sense of what made Planck unique as a scientist. Einstein writes, many kinds of men devote themselves to science, and not all for the sake of science herself. There are some who come into her temple because it offers them the opportunity to display their particular talents. There is another class of men who come into the temple to make an offering of their brain pulp in the hope of securing a profitable return. These men are scientists only by the chance of some circumstance which offered itself when making a choice of career. But a few worshippers would still remain, some from former times and some from ours. To these latter belongs our Planck, and that is why we love him. What Einstein is saying here is that some scientists do it for glory, some scientists do it for money, some scientists do it for the application, but then there are a few people, true devotees like Planck himself, who do it out of pure love for science. And Einstein closes that tribute by rejecting the idea that Planck's success came merely from, quote, energy and discipline. He says, I believe they are wrong. The state of mind which furnishes the driving power here resembles that of the devotee or the lover. The long-sustained effort is not inspired by any set plan or purpose. Its inspiration arises from a hunger of the soul. And Einstein recognizes in Planck what he knows in himself, that a real scientist just wants to know the mind of God, how the universe works, the laws governing our world. And this is true for all of the scientists that we've covered on the podcast, right? Whether they're mathematicians like Paul Erdős or physicists like Feynman and Einstein, they don't just pursue science as an intellectual career. And from reading other scientific biographies, which we'll cover in later episodes, I'll say this is probably one of the most common themes amongst them. It's the same quest over and over again, just with a different scientist. And behind Max Planck's scientific achievements, his personal life is actually marked by unfortunate, extraordinary tragedies. In 1887, Planck is 29. He marries his first wife, Marie, and together they have 4 children. Carl is born in 1888. He has twin daughters, Emma and Greet, who are born in 1889. And Erwin, born in 1893, becomes his father's favorite child. And this period probably marked the happiest time in Planck's life. His 4 children are alive, they're healthy, his scientific reputation is growing, and Berlin is becoming the center of physics worldwide. However, in 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, things begin to change. Initially, the war fills Planck and his family with patriotism, the same way it did with his family 40 years earlier. But as the newly appointed head of the University of Berlin, many people expected Planck to be and sound more patriotic. And Planck said early on in the war, "It is a great feeling to be able to call oneself German. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. We only suspect that something great, along with something monstrous, will soon confront our people, that it will touch the life and property, the honor, and perhaps the existence of the nation." So both of his sons, Carl and Erwin, enter military service, and this brings Planck immense pride. He gives them their blessing, but the tragedies begin to unfold here. In 1916, just 2 years after the beginning of the war, his oldest son, Carl, is killed in a battle. And in a letter afterwards, Planck writes, "My dearest wish is that he didn't suffer anymore. The pain of this war you only feel for real when you feel it in your own flesh and blood. There were times where I was not without sorrow for Carl's future. Then his life didn't seem so precious to me as it's been presented to me now. Without the war, I never would have known his value, and now that I know it, I must lose him." And when Planck is talking about Carl's future, he's referring to before the war, Carl had no particular drive or direction. And for someone like Planck, who has this nearly inhuman focus, it created a lot of tension between father and son. But now Planck is essentially admitting that he couldn't fully appreciate his son during his life, right, because of this tension. And only now, after his son's death, can he recognize his true value. And unfortunately, the tragedies would continue. In 1917, his daughter Greet died during childbirth, and just 2 years later, in 1919, his other daughter, Emma, dies during childbirth as well. So neither of the twin daughters lived past the age of 30, and within just 3 years, Planck loses 3 of his 4 children. And Einstein wrote to a friend after seeing Planck after the deaths of his children, he writes, "Planck's misfortune wrings my heart. I could not hold back the tears when I saw him. He was wonderfully courageous and erect, but you could see the grief eating away at him." Planck is trying to live by his motto, "One must be an optimist," even during the most difficult and darkest times. And he still finds a way to be somewhat courageous and continue with his life, continue with his science. And Planck, after the deaths, writes to a friend, "There have been times when I doubted the value of life itself." Planck loses 3 of his 4 children, and the man who had discovered quantum theory, who had just reached the pinnacle of scientific recognition and achievement with the Nobel Prize in 1918, 1919, he's now questioning whether life itself has meaning. But again, Planck is incredibly able to maintain his characteristic optimism. In a letter to a relative later, he writes, "There are still many precious things on the earth and many high callings, and the value of life in the last analysis is determined by the way it is lived." I just think the resilience here, facing such devastating losses again, and again, speaks to the extraordinary depth of Planck's character. And despite not being religious or believing in God in the typical sense, Planck actually credited his religious faith as his main source of strength during these difficult times. He says, "If there is consolation anywhere, it is in the eternal. And I consider it a grace of heaven that belief in the eternal has been rooted deeply in me since childhood." And as if losing 3 children in the span of 3 years and really doubting life itself wasn't difficult enough, the rise of Hitler's regime in 1933 presented Planck with another difficult challenge to manage. And Planck is 75 when Hitler comes to power. And this is where Planck's story becomes a little bit more morally complex. His patriotism and sense of duty, again, right, this idea of duty to Germany and duty to preserve German science led him to compromises within the Nazi regime. He kind of aligns himself with the Nazis. And Planck dedicated himself to the idea that he could do more within the regime than resisting it, right? Initially, Planck attempted to work within the system, believing that the Nazis would prove only to be temporary. And Planck was really caught between this incredible allegiance and identification with Germany, right? He has this sense of duty, he has this sense of patriotism on one hand, and the practical reality of what he could possibly accomplish in protest on the other. So he decides to do more of the former. In the years prior to the Nazis, Planck really restricted much of his political activity to only what affected science directly. He said, "There is no bond that unites the different countries of the earth with their widely divergent interests so directly and harmoniously as science." So, right, all of his political involvement before, during, and after the Nazis is just in order to preserve the continuity of science, to preserve German science as a leader in the world. And he sees this as the best way to bring different peoples together. But in 1933, some of his sentiment with the Nazis begins to change. He receives a birthday note from Hitler, and Planck replies with a request to meet and to discuss the future of German science, and he tries to advocate for Jewish colleagues not being dismissed from their position. But when Planck raises some of these concerns during the meeting, Hitler predictably goes crazy, and it kind of shakes Planck to its core. And Planck said afterward, "You have come to get my advice on political questions, but I am afraid I can no longer advise you. I see no hope of stopping the catastrophe that is about to engulf all of our universities, indeed our whole country. You simply cannot stop a landslide once it has started." But despite this sobering realization, right, Planck chooses to stay in Germany. And the book says, "Friendships, unlike dedication to the homeland, could be shed when duty called." And here too, we see a major difference between Einstein and Planck. Einstein said, "Nationalism is an infantile disease, the measles of mankind." Right? Einstein considered himself a man of the world. He didn't really consider himself a German. And Einstein gets exiled by the Nazis. He came to see nationalism as a disease. Meanwhile, Planck, who is so deeply rooted in German culture and identity, continued to believe in the value of national tradition and patriotism, even as that morphed into something more monstrous that he could imagine with the Nazis. But as president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which was Germany's leading research organization at the time, he followed the Nazis' orders to dismiss Jewish members and colleagues and professors, though he did continue to advocate quietly for some individual cases. But his actions here drew criticism during his life and after his life. One Jewish physicist, Lot Warburg, said, "Such a monstrous lie. Everyone will say, 'Ah, Planck, there's an honorable character.' No one will get at the truth, at the monumental cowardice and spinelessness with which his last years were filled." And right, this is a difficult part of Planck's legacy and life to grapple with. His compromises with the Nazi regime kind of have tarnished some of his moral standing for some people. But on the other hand, other people point to small acts of resistance and argue that he did what he could within this regime and within this system. For example, in 1935, while he's giving a talk titled "Physics Struggling for a Worldview," Planck made what many people considered his first public criticism of the Nazi regime. He says, "The scientific irrefutability and consistency of physics compromises the direct challenge of truthfulness and honesty. Justness is inseparable from devotion to the truth. So too does a society of people require the same privilege. Woe to a community when its sense of the guarantee of justice begins to vacillate." And it's these small acts, and he has a couple others, that people point to show some of Planck's resistance and that he wasn't completely capitulating to the Nazis. But in 1944, Planck probably experiences the most devastating loss. His youngest son, Erwin, the only son remaining from his first marriage, it's his closest friend at the time, the last surviving child from his first marriage. He is implicated in a plot to assassinate Hitler. So the Gestapo arrests Erwin in July of 1944. And despite Planck's desperate attempts and letters to Hitler and Himmler pleading for mercy, Erwin is sentenced to death. And in a letter to Hitler, Planck writes, "I am deeply shaken by the news that my son Erwin was sentenced to death by the People's Court, as you've repeatedly commended me in the most honorable expression of recognition for my achievements in the service of our fatherland. I feel entitled to ask that you lend a sympathetic ear to an 87-year-old. As thanks from the German people for my life's work, which has become an everlasting intellectual asset for Germany, I ask for my son's life." Again, this is incredible. Here is Planck, one of the greatest scientists in German history, one of the greatest scientists ever. He is reduced to begging for his son's life from a dictator. And unfortunately, these pleas go unanswered. And in January of 1945, the following year, Erwin Planck is hanged. And Planck, he's 87 years old at the time. He writes, "He was a precious part of my being. He was my sunshine, my pride, my hope. My grief cannot be expressed in words." Right? Planck had already lost 3 of his children. Erwin, his favorite, his closest friend, his musical companion with Einstein, is now executed by the same regime he had tried to work with. It's just an incredible story, right? This is where the title of the biography, Driven by Vision, Broken by War, comes to reality. He's so driven by this idea of absoluteness, objectivity, eternal, simple truth. At the same time, he is broken by World War I, the loss of his first son. He's broken by the loss of his 2 daughters within 2 years of each other. And then lastly, he tries to work with the Nazis. He tries to do his best to preserve German science so that it could outlast the Nazis. But it's the same leadership, it's the same regime that takes his last son from him. In the midst of such personal losses, it's remarkable to remember that in the background, Planck's 1900 breakthrough is quietly revolutionizing physics. In 1913, Niels Bohr presented his new vision of the atom, and he's using Planck's quantum idea to explain why electrons could only occupy certain orbits. Then in 1925, Werner Heisenberg formulated his matrix mechanics, which is followed by Schrödinger's wave mechanics in 1926. And it's in 1926, when Planck is 68, he initially welcomed some of these new developments, as he did earlier with Einstein's idea on relativity, right? He's very adoptive of new ideas. He champions them as much as he can. However, this time, he also made a statement that would soon be proven dramatically wrong. It says, he had first welcomed a new take on quantum theory called quantum mechanics, dreamed up by a young group of physicists from Göttingen. He was proud that the emergency funding apparatus had kept these young guns blazing. But in that same year, he publicly announced that experiments could measure nature without affecting it, that laboratory questions wouldn't influence nature's answers. But he ends up being completely wrong, and his timing really couldn't have been worse. So the father of quantum theory was still trapped in his classical thinking, in his classical worldview of the 1800s and early 1900s, that he couldn't fully accept the implications of what he had started. And Einstein had the same issue. Planck said, causality is the fact that natural phenomena invariably occur according to the rigid sequence of cause and effect. This is an indispensable postulate of all scientific research. But again, this new generation, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, rejected these outdated ideas. And Heisenberg was very blunt to counter this. He says, when one wishes to calculate the future from the present, one can only get statistical results. And Bohr goes even further. He challenges physics' actual purpose. He says, it is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Instead, physics could only discover what humans could reliably say about nature. We'll see that despite maybe not fully understanding or grasping the implications of these ideas, Planck again shows remarkable intellectual flexibility for his age. Right? He initially called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, quote unquote, ominous and a unacceptable limitation of the freedom of thought. But over time, he evolves, he moderates his stance, and later in life, he wrote, the law of causality is neither true nor false. It is rather a signpost, and in my opinion, our most valuable signpost, to help us find our bearings in a bewildering maze of occurrences. Right? And even in his 70s and 80s, he could reconsider his ideas in light of new evidence. And even as physics moved beyond his full comprehension or his ability to accept it, he maintained this childlike wonder at the universe. He says, compared with immeasurably rich, ever-young nature, advanced as man may be in scientific knowledge and insight, he must forever remain the wondering child and must constantly be prepared for new surprises. Right? This reminds me of what we discussed about in episode 3 with Richard Feynman, who shares a very similar sentiment. The same thrill, the same awe and mystery comes again and again when we look at any question deeply enough. With more knowledge comes a deeper, more wonderful mystery. And again, it's just the idea that even if things are going beyond your full comprehension, it's still worth pursuing them and asking questions because it gets us ultimately pushing on a new frontier of physics, a new frontier understanding of the laws of the universe and how the universe works. But Planck's scientific legacy extends beyond just his discovery of energy quanta, right? Planck's discovery of the quantum of action, which is represented by the constant H, which is now called Planck's constant, is the elementary unit of action in quantum mechanics, which fundamentally changed our understanding of energy. And Einstein captured this significance shortly after Planck's death. He said, his discovery became the basis of all 20th century research in physics and has almost entirely conditioned its development ever since. Without this discovery, it would not have been possible to establish a workable theory of atoms and molecules and the energetic processes which govern their transformation. Think about this. Einstein is saying the basis of all 20th century research in physics, that includes everything from nuclear power to semiconductors to electronics to lasers, all of that is because of Planck's discoveries. And Planck himself was initially pretty modest about his breakthrough. This is pretty predictable given his personality and his character. He initially called it a purely formal assumption, but he recognized only later that the revolutionary potential of it. He wrote in his diary, the quantum's full explanation cannot be done by considering a state, but only by considering a process. In other words, we are not concerned here with a theory of atomism in space, but with atomism in time. Via processes we usually think of as continuous in time that have, in fact, temporal discontinuities. That the laws of ordinary mechanics and electrodynamics, which always presuppose temporal continuity, are inadequate here, may well be considered certain. And Planck here he's recognizing that his discovery wasn't just about energy coming in discrete packages or discrete units. It was about processes being fundamentally discontinuous at the quantum scale, right? And this broke with centuries of physics that assumed there were smooth, continuous changes like energy. And the book says, our understanding of the building blocks and the structure of matter traced directly to Planck's work. And our understanding of how separate chunks of matter then exchange energy, how they chat and inform one another, also starts with Planck's primary discovery. And beyond Planck's quantum ideas, he also elevated and refined this concept of entropy in the universe, right? The universe becomes more disordered over time. And this was also the first problem, the first area of science that Planck dedicated himself to. In his doctoral dissertation, he writes, the process of heat conduction cannot be completely reversed by any means. And he saw this concept of irreversibility as, quote, the fundamental task of theoretical physics, right? It's this contribution to thermodynamics that gets often overshadowed by his work in quantum ideas, but it's extremely important. Planck's formulation of the second law of thermodynamics actually helps establish the directionality of time in physics, and it's one of the fundamental differences between past, present, and future. And this remains one of the unsolved problems in physics, right? Why does time flow in one direction? And that is what Planck dedicated many, many years of his scientific career towards. And even beyond his quantum ideas and thermodynamics, he also introduced this idea of natural units, a system of measurement that was based solely on fundamental constants of nature. He said, with their help, we have the possibility of establishing units of length, time, mass, and temperature, which necessarily retain their significance for all cultures, even unearthly and non-human ones. He believed these natural units would be so objective, right? This idea of objectivity keeps coming up again and again. And he said that any group of scientists, not merely humans, but even extraterrestrials, would necessarily arrive at these units and agree on their values. And the book says, the existence of these constants is a palpable proof of the existence and nature of something real and independent of every human measurement. But part of Planck's greatness as a scientist was his breadth and depth. One of his biographers wrote, Planck, stripped of his black bodywork, would still be famous today. Even without his quantum breakthrough or work in thermodynamics, Planck would still be considered a major physicist because he made substantial contributions across multiple areas of physics over many, many years. He wasn't just a one-hit wonder. The legacy of Planck's equation from 1900 wasn't actually confirmed until 1964, and this actually happens by accident when two astronomers, Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the leftover microwave radiation from the Big Bang, and its spectrum perfectly matched Planck's radiation law from 1900, and this demonstrated that his work didn't just apply to everyday objects, but to the cosmos itself. Throughout his life, Planck developed a pretty rich philosophical outlook that influenced and informed both his scientific work, but also how he responded to personal tragedies and personal events. At the heart of Planck's worldview was this belief in the rational order of the universe and the search for absolute truths. And we see the same drive, the same belief with Erdős, with Einstein, and with Feynman. And in Planck's scientific autobiography, he writes, "My original decision to devote myself to science was a direct result of the discovery which has never ceased to fill me with enthusiasm." And in his scientific autobiography, he writes about his entire approach to science. He says, "It is of paramount importance that the outside world is something independent from man, something absolute. And the quest for the laws which apply to this absolute appear to me as the most sublime scientific pursuit in life." Right? That this quest for the laws of nature and the universe and the belief that there is some objective reality independent of our senses, independent of human perception, this is the cornerstone, the bedrock, the foundation of Planck's life's work, his entire career as a scientist. And it's this faith that shaped his approach to physics, right? He believed that behind the complex phenomena of nature and the universe and the world lay just simple universal principles. He says, no, there must exist in science too absolutely correct and final maxims, just as there are absolute values in ethics. Moreover, and this is the main thing, these very propositions, maxims, and values are the most important and worthwhile goals of every endeavor. This is probably why Planck was resistant to some of the ideas and elements of quantum mechanics, right? Particularly the probabilistic nature of it. He believed in enduring absolute laws and principles, not statistical approximations or guesses. And right, his commitment to this absoluteness of nature and objectivity of nature influences his scientific judgment. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes for worse when it comes to quantum mechanics. And Planck combined this scientific faith, this scientific outlook, with a deep personal faith. Although he described himself as not imagining, quote, a personal God, let alone a Christian God, he did serve as a church elder for many, many years. In one of his popular lectures titled Religion and Natural Science, he argued that science and religion aren't contradictory, but rather complementary. He says, "Religion and natural science do not exclude each other as many contemporaries of ours would believe or fear. They mutually supplement and condition each other. They find agreement, first of all, on the point that there exists a rational world order independent from man, and secondly, on the view that the character of the world order can never be directly known, but can only be indirectly recognized or suspected." Planck sees both religion and science as complementary approaches to understanding reality, understanding the universe, understanding how the world works. And they actually share this belief in a rational order, but they approach it from different directions with different methods, right? He says, while both religion and natural science require a belief in God for their activities, to the former, he is the starting point. To the latter, the goal of every thought process. To the former, he is the foundation. To the latter, the crown of the edifice of every generalized worldview. And this is a really interesting framework, right? He's saying for religion, God is the starting point, right? It's the foundation of understanding. But for science, God, or the ultimate truth, that is the goal. That's what we're seeking through our investigation, through our scientific inquiry. The reason that all these scientists are doing that is to get to that point. But later he says, natural science wants men to learn. Religion wants him to act. And again, he believed that both religion and science shared a common quest, right? They shared a common goal. He said, religion and natural science are fighting a joint battle in an incessant, never relaxing crusade against skepticism and against dogmatism, against disbelief and against superstition. By early 1945, Nazi Germany is coming to its end. Planck is 87 years old at the time and has almost lost everything, right? He lost his home in Berlin. He lost his library. He lost his friend. He lost his personal journals. He lost his 4 children. He lost his first wife. His youngest son, his most favorite son, is executed. And now German science was morally and intellectually bankrupt towards the end of the Nazi regime. The book says, although fate may have been cruel to Planck, it was so emblematic of his time and place, the curve of his life traces that of his homeland, right? And the parallel between Planck's personal life and Germany is actually quite similar if you think about it, right? Planck is born in Germany while it's flourishing, it's rising culturally, scientifically, artistically, and he reached his peak during the nation's scientific golden age, right, in the early 1900s. And then both Planck and Germany as a country experience this decline, division, right? He loses his friends and devastation alongside Germany as the Nazis come to power through World War II. But despite his advanced age and obviously immense personal losses, Planck refused to surrender to bitterness. His motto has always been, one must be an optimist. And he writes, I am not one of those who let themselves be bitter. So after the war, the Allies turned to Planck to help rebuild German science, and he agrees to once again direct the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. And in 1946, the organization was renamed the Max Planck Society for the Advancements of Science. And when Planck gave his blessing to use his name for the society, he said that he hoped for a society committed only to the truth of science, independent of all currents of a particular time, right? Having gone through what the Nazis did to Germany, not only as a country, but to German science, turning it into propaganda, perverting it, losing all of the Jewish colleagues. He wanted that science to be independent of all political affairs. And this renaming was more than just a symbolic gesture, right? It was a deliberate break from Nazi Germany's past and a recommitment to the values that Planck himself embodied as a person and as a scientist, right? The intellectual integrity, the pursuit of truth, independent of political pressure, and this idea that science is a way for international cooperation. In 1947, Planck's health begins to deteriorate rapidly. And that summer of 1947, he suffers a fall that he never really fully recovers from. And in October of that year, 1947, Max Planck dies. He's 89 years old. And his second wife, Marga, wrote, quote, he was so tired, so exhausted, I must not grudge him his rest, and I look gratefully back on the life I was allowed to live at the side of this rare man. And at the funeral, the physicist Max von Laue actually gives the ceremonial speech, and Planck had been friends with von Laue since they worked together in 1903 on his PhD dissertation, right? Max von Laue was the student, and Planck was the PhD advisor. And I think the fondness comes from a sense of Planck saw in von Laue what he saw in himself, right? They both lived and breathed physics, not as a career, but as a compulsion, a search for truth, both universal and absolute. They're both seeking the same thing, right? They're both seeking to understand the universe. They're searching for truths. And after his funeral, Marga received a letter from Einstein, who was, right, at one time a very close friend of Planck, but they became fractured and estranged during the war. But Einstein wrote after his death, now your husband has finished his days after he achieved greatness and experienced much bitterness. His gaze was fixed on the eternal things, yet he took an active part in all that was human, and he lived in the temporal sphere. How different and better the human world would be if there were more such unique people among the leaders. So it seems not to be, as the noble characters in every time and every place must remain isolated without being able to influence the events around them. The hours that I spent in your home and the many conversations that I conducted in private with the wonderful man will for the rest of my life belong to my beautiful memories. It cannot change the fact that a tragic event tore us apart. In today's loneliness, may you find comfort in that you have brought sun and harmony into the life of this revered man. From a distance, I share with you the pain of parting. And Einstein's characterization of Planck here, right, it captures his essence perfectly. His gaze was fixed on the eternal things, and yet he took an active part in all that was human, and he lived in the temporal sphere. It's this combination, the pursuit of the timeless, absolute truths, while remaining engaged with human reality and doing social things and being a good father, being a good family man, that made Planck such a unique scientist and such a unique person. And this is another quote which I love that really gives you a sense of the beauty and struggle of being a scientist. And Planck writes this in his autobiography. He says, every discovery made by any individual acquires a completely universal significance. This gives the inquirer wrestling with his problem in quiet seclusion the assurance that every discovery will win the unhesitating recognition of all experts throughout the entire world. And in this feeling of the importance of his work lies his happiness. It compensates him fully for many a sacrifice which he must make in his daily life. And what makes Planck's story so compelling is not just his scientific brilliance, his scientific achievements, but it's the qualities that define him as a person, right? It's his methodical nature, it's his logical mind, it's his openness to new ideas despite being maybe older and more conservative in nature. It's his motto that one must be an optimist, and he lives by this in the most unspeakable losses and devastating tragedies. And he has this deep faith in a rational universe, in a world order that is driven by elegant, simple, beautiful truths and laws. And Einstein talked about Planck's unique duality, right? This duality of scientific genius and personal nobility. He says his ideas will be effective as long as physical science lasts. and I hope that the example which his personal life affords will not be less effective with later generations of scientists. And this is part of the essence of Planck's legacy, right? It's not just his scientific achievements and theories and proofs and equations, but it's his personal example, his model character, it's his integrity, his resilience, his adaptiveness. It's these qualities that make him not just an accomplished scientist, but an accomplished person in life. And Planck wrote about why his scientific journey mattered so much to him. He said, the more the child matures, and the more complete his world picture becomes, the less frequently he finds reason to wonder. And when he has grown up, his world picture has solidified and taken on a certain form. He accepts this picture as a matter of course and ceases to wonder. Is this because the adult has fully fathomed the correlations and the necessity of the structure of his world picture? Nothing could be more erroneous than this idea. Planck saw that our lack of wonder isn't because we solved the mysteries of the universe or the mysteries of existence. It's just because we've gotten used to them, right? The fundamental questions of like why these particular laws and not other laws are the ones that govern the universe, that remained pursuing for Planck, and he maintained this childlike wonder and curiosity throughout his entire life. He says, the real marvel is that we encounter natural laws at all, which are the same for men of all races and nations. And it was this sense of wonder that was the driving force that made him devote himself to try to understand these natural laws, to try to understand how the universe works. He says, how pitifully small, how powerless we human beings must appear to ourselves if we stop to think that the planet Earth on which we live our lives is just a minute, infinitesimal mote of dust. On the other hand, how peculiar it must seem that we, tiny creatures on a tiny planet, are nevertheless capable of knowing, though not the essence, at least the existence and dimensions of the basic building blocks of the entire great cosmos. And maybe just to close here, like we talked a little bit about this in episode 3 with Richard Feynman, right? When Feynman says, out of the cradle onto dry land, here it is standing, atoms with consciousness, matter with curiosity, I, a universe of atoms, an atom in the universe. And this is an amazing reflection from Feynman, right? He's saying that each of us is made of lifeless atoms, yet somehow those atoms are organized and they come together to create consciousness. And this consciousness is capable of understanding and reasoning the universe, the laws, the truths behind it. So it's amazing to see how both Planck and Feynman have the same perspective of like, yes, we're these tiny creatures on a tiny planet. Yes, we're these collection of tiny lifeless, unconscious atoms, but in aggregate, when they come together, we're able to use this to reason, to understand how the world works, how the universe works. And we talked a lot about duty and how that informed and influenced Planck's scientific career, but also his personal life. And I think this quote really drives it home. He says, the only thing that we may claim for our own with absolute assurance, the greatest good that no power in the world can take from us, and one that can give us more permanent happiness than anything else, is integrity of soul, which manifests itself in a conscientious performance of one's duty. Again, right? We see this idea of duty. It's the bedrock of his entire approach to life. It's the foundation of his scientific work. He's literally saying here that permanent happiness comes from performing one's duty. I loved reading about Planck. I think he generally doesn't get the credit he deserves, right? From a scientific perspective, launching or at least seeding the ideas of the quantum mechanics revolution, but also he has this incredible character and perseverance that we talked about a lot in this episode that I think anyone can learn from, whether you're a scientist or not. So thank you for listening to this episode of Birds and Frogs. Until next time.